Picture like a crisp, beautiful April morning in a post-World War II American boomtown. The air is cool, the economy is roaring, and the docks are just completely bustling with workers loading cargo bound for a war-torn Europe.
Right, it's the absolute picture of mid-century progress.
Exactly. American industrial might at its peak, but deep inside the cargo hold of a moored ship, a simple puff of smoke is about to trigger the deadliest industrial accident in United States history. Welcome to a new deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we are exploring the 1947 Texas City disaster, and we are going to dissect how a cascade of completely preventable human errors, systemic complacency, and honestly a massive regulatory void created a catastrophe that fundamentally altered American law.
But we're not just reading a textbook for this one.
No, definitely not. We are pulling insights from a really fascinating stack of sources to figure this out. We've got everything from Texas A&M's archaeological records and modern hazmat protocols to this incredibly detailed, award-winning historical project put together by a middle school student named Evan Knapp.
Which is just a fantastic resource, by the way.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how an entire city gets blown apart, you first have to understand the mindset of the people living there.
Yeah, you really have to look at the environment that made this level of risk acceptable. I mean, Texas City in 1947 was a bustling deep-water port right inland from Galveston. It had straight access to the Gulf of Mexico.
And it was booming, right?
Oh, completely unrestrained growth. Coming out of the Great Depression and World War II, it had become a major hub for chemical and oil plants. And with that rapid industrial expansion came a severe housing shortage.
Right, because everybody's moving there for work.
Exactly. So to fit everyone in, residential neighborhoods were built right up against the industrial zones. We were talking about family homes sitting just a half-mile away from major chemical refineries and commercial piers.
Within a single-mile radius, you had, I think it was 6 major chemical or oil companies, 9 piers, 11 warehouses, a grain elevator, and countless civilian homes. It's wild to think about now.
It really is.
Like today, if you proposed zoning a neighborhood next to a highly volatile chemical plant, you'd be laughed right out of a city council meeting.
Oh, absolutely. But you have to remember, they were fresh out of a global depression and a world war. A busy smoking factory wasn't a hazard to them. It was a sign of prosperity.
It's kind of like living next door to a sleeping dragon, but treating it like a harmless house cat. The danger didn't feel real because, well, the worst just hadn't happened yet.
That's a great way to put it. That post-war prosperity bred this remarkable tolerance for risk. The safety culture was incredibly lax because the primary focus was entirely on production and export.
Output over mitigation.
Exactly. For instance, smoking was strictly prohibited on the docks, but the rule was treated as merely a suggestion by almost everyone working there.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the floating bomb at the center of this story, the SS Grandcamp.
Right, the Grandcamp.
This was a French-crewed Liberty ship originally built in Los Angeles, but taking on cargo in Texas City. And the cargo was, well, volatile feels like an understatement.
Yeah, they were loading roughly 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. And the physical composition of that fertilizer is the critical flaw here.
Because it wasn't just fertilizer.
Right. During the war, this chemical was used for explosives. Now, it was being repurposed to help fertilize the exhausted farmlands of Europe. But to prevent the ammonium nitrate from caking together in the humid marine environment, manufacturers mixed it with combustible clay, rosin, and paraffin wax.
So they essentially took a highly reactive chemical and wrapped it in fuel.
Basically, yes.
And the surrounding cargo in the ship's holds wasn't much better. I read they had large balls of sisal twine, peanuts, tobacco, cotton, and, just for good measure, cases of small arms ammunition.
Just a completely chaotic mix of flammables.
You read the historical accounts, and it's like storing a mountain of matches in a room full of striking paper, and assuming that because nobody has sneezed yet, you're perfectly safe.
And there were actually warning signs. The sources even note that longshoremen reported the bags of fertilizer were literally warm to the touch before they were even loaded onto the ship.
Wait, warm to the touch before loading?
Yes. That ambient heat should have been a glaring red flag. But again, systemic complacency overrides individual observation.
Wow.
They were just so used to the constant low-level hum of industrial hazard that anomalies like warm cargo were ignored just to keep the loading schedule on track.
So that brings us to the morning of April 16th. Around 8 a.m., longshoremen working down in Hold 4 smell smoke. They trace it to a plume rising between the cargo holds and the ship's hull, maybe 7 or 8 layers of sacks down.
And their initial response is, well, it's pretty shocking.
Yeah, I had to read this 3 times to believe it. They attempt to fight a deep-seated chemical fire with a 1-gallon jug of drinking water and 2 small hand extinguishers.
It's almost absurd.
Wait, a single gallon of drinking water for a smoldering cargo hold? That's not a firefighting strategy, that's a slapstick routine with tragic consequences.
It really highlights how entirely unprepared the dock workers were for an emergency of any scale. Unsurprisingly, the jug of water does absolutely nothing.
Right.
The hold quickly begins filling with thick smoke. The men evacuate, and the ship's captain, Charles de Guillaume, steps in to make a decision that ultimately seals the fate of the city.
Okay, what does he do?
He strictly forbids his crew from using the ship's fire hoses.
Because he wanted to protect the financial value of the cargo, right? He didn't want the water to ruin the fertilizer?
That was his rationale. It was a standard maritime instinct to prevent cargo spoilage. Instead of water, he orders the hatches to be battened down, covered with the tarpaulins, the ventilators closed, and he has his crew pump compressed steam into the hold to smother the fire.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because smothering a fire with steam is actually a totally standard firefighting tactic for a lot of enclosed spaces. You displace the oxygen, the fire starves, problem solved.
Normally, yes.
But applying that logic to this specific chemical was a fatal misunderstanding of what was actually burning. We know ammonium nitrate is a powerful oxidizer. So what exactly did pumping hot steam into that sealed hold actually do to the cargo?
It created the worst possible chemical chain reaction. Because ammonium nitrate is an oxidizer, it doesn't need external air to burn. As it decomposes, it releases massive amounts of its own oxygen.
Oh, wow. So starving it of air does nothing.
Exactly. Steam isn't some magical smothering agent in this scenario. It is essentially just intense heat and pressure. By sealing the hold and pumping in superheated steam, the captain drastically accelerated the decomposition of the ammonium nitrate.
So he just fed it.
He did. The chemical reaction fed on the heat, producing tremendous amounts of oxygen and nitrous oxide.
So he didn't smother the fire at all. He turned the cargo hold into a giant pressure cooker, rapidly cooking 2,300 tons of oxidizing fertilizer until it reached a critical explosive threshold.
It is agonizing to think about.
It really is. A maritime standard operating procedure applied to the wrong chemical guarantees the destruction of the ship.
And the surrounding city. Because by 8:30 a.m., the internal pressure inside Hold 4 is so immense that it physically blows the heavy hatch covers right off the deck.
Which releases this thick, towering column of beautiful, bright yellow-orange smoke.
Right, which is nitrogen dioxide, highly toxic.
But the people waking up in Texas City didn't know the chemistry. They just saw this incredibly unusual, vibrant smoke billowing up into the clear morning sky. And that visual, combined with the wailing sirens of the terminal railway, actually drew a crowd.
A huge crowd.
Yeah, around 500 curious spectators, including a lot of children, gathered along the shoreline to watch the spectacle. They honestly believed they were standing at a perfectly safe distance to watch a boat fire.
Meanwhile, the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department arrives on the docks. 27 of their 28 men are setting up hoses, trying to cool the exterior deck of the Grandcamp.
Which is so incredibly hot by this point that the water is instantly vaporizing the second it touches the steel.
The firefighters were walking into an unwinnable situation. Standard structural firefighting gear and water hoses offer absolutely zero defense against an impending chemical detonation of that magnitude.
And at 9:12 a.m., the pressure cooker fails. The Grandcamp detonates.
The blast was just... it's hard to even describe.
When you look at the historical comparisons, it's almost incomprehensible. Witnesses on the ground who had served in the war compared the devastation to the 1943 air raid on Bari, Italy, or even the nuclear detonation at Nagasaki.
The physics of the explosion paint a terrifying picture. The blast instantly vaporized the ship, blowing nearly 6,350 tons of the Grandcamp steel hull into the air.
With fragments traveling at supersonic speeds.
Yes. And the atmospheric shockwave was so violently powerful, it literally knocked 2 small sightseeing planes right out of the sky above the port.
And it displaced so much water in the bay that it generated a 15-foot tsunami. That wave picked up a massive steel barge from the water and just pushed it deep ashore, while simultaneously sucking dead and injured people back out into the turning basin as the water receded.
Shrapnel damage was apocalyptic.
Yeah, a 2-ton anchor from the Grandcamp was hurled 1.6 miles inland, leaving a 10-foot crater where it landed. And the Monsanto Chemical Company plant, which was located right across the slip from the ship, was practically erased. Of the workers and contractors clocking in there that morning, 234 were killed instantly.
The sheer force carried for miles. Half the windows in Galveston, which is 8 miles away, were shattered in an instant. People 20 miles away in Baytown felt their buildings violently sway.
Wow.
But the most immediate crisis for Texas City was the absolute loss of its first responders. Every single one of those 27 volunteer firemen standing on the dock was killed in a fraction of a second.
Their fire engines were just reduced to twisted, burned husks, wiping out the entire department in an instant.
It's just devastating.
The only surviving member of the Texas City Fire Department was a man named Fred Dowdy, simply because he hadn't responded to the initial call. He was suddenly left completely alone in a destroyed city, tasked with coordinating the response of 200 incoming emergency workers pouring in from neighboring towns.
And that loss of the firefighting force meant the city was entirely defenseless against the secondary fires. The explosion had sent flaming bales of sisal twine and cotton raining down from the sky, igniting ruptured chemical tanks and oil refineries all along the industrial waterfront.
The entire port was burning.
And there was no one left to fight it.
And just as the stunned, bleeding city is trying to pull itself out of the rubble and oily black water, you realize the initial blast didn't just clear the docks. It unleashed a delayed trap.
Right. The shockwave from the Grandcamp was so intense it tore another moored Liberty ship, the SS Highflyer, completely free from its thick mooring lines.
It drifted mindlessly across the slip until it became lodged against a third ship, the SS Wilson B. Keene. Let me guess. Don't tell me the Highflyer was also packed with wax-coated fertilizer.
Worse, it was holding 961 tons of ammonium nitrate, sitting right alongside 1,800 tons of highly flammable sulfur.
Unbelievable. A second floating bomb, now adrift in a burning port.
The Highflyer had taken heavy damage from the initial blast, but its crew actually stayed aboard for about an hour. They only evacuated when the thick, choking sulfur fumes from a smoldering fire below decks forced them off.
So they knew it was burning.
Yes. Later that same afternoon, as people were desperately searching the port for survivors, several individuals boarded the Highflyer and visually confirmed flames coming from one of the cargo holds.
But those warnings just vanished into the void, didn't they? Because the city's leadership was dead or incapacitated, the phone lines were destroyed, and there was no centralized command to process that information.
That is the fatal flaw of having no unified port authority or centralized disaster plan. Information wasn't flowing anywhere. It wasn't until 11 p.m., nearly 14 hours after the first blast, that volunteer tugboats from Galveston finally arrived with orders to try and pull the burning Highflyer away from the docks.
Oh, man.
They struggled in the dark for hours. They even managed to cut the anchor chain, but the ship was hopelessly wedged against the Wilson B. Keene. They simply couldn't free it.
So they are forced to abandon the effort. And at 1:10 a.m. the next morning, the trap springs. The Highflyer explodes. And witnesses who survived both blasts said this nighttime detonation felt even more powerful than the first.
The destruction was total. It completely obliterated the Wilson B. Keene next to it. And because the steel frame of the Highflyer had been superheated by the intense sulfur fire until the metal was literally glowing red hot, the explosion sent incandescent chunks of steel arching high into the night sky.
Like meteorites.
Exactly. They rained down for miles, igniting previously untouched crude oil tanks that had survived the morning. One of the Highflyer's massive propellers was blown completely off its shaft and was later found nearly a mile inland.
The final statistics of those 2 days are just staggering. The official casualty figures stand at 581 dead. That includes 63 unidentified victims who had to be buried together in a memorial cemetery near Moses Lake because the sheer violence of the blast made identification impossible.
Just heartbreaking.
Over 5,000 people were injured. The property damage was estimated at $100 million in 1947 dollars. That translates to well over $1 billion today. More than 800 people were left orphaned or widowed. It was an absolute erasure of life and livelihood.
The physical and emotional scars left on Texas City were profound. But as the literal smoke eventually cleared, the legal and regulatory fires were just beginning to ignite. This disaster forced the American legal system to grapple with the consequences of state-sponsored industrial negligence.
Right, and this is where that middle school students project, Evan Knapp's research, provides this incredible lens into the legacy of the disaster, because Texas City sparked the very first class action lawsuit against the United States government under the newly enacted 1946 Federal Tort Claims Act.
The landmark case was Elizabeth Dalehite et al. Versus United States. It represented nearly 8,500 plaintiffs who had lost family members or property.
That's a massive lawsuit.
It was. Their core argument was that the federal government was fundamentally responsible for the catastrophe because they had initiated and managed the fertilizer export program.
And the initial district court actually agreed with the citizens. In 1950, a federal judge found 168 named government agencies responsible for a whole litany of negligent acts.
They really laid it all out.
They cited negligence in the manufacturing process, the failure to use safe packaging, the lack of proper warning labels, and the total lack of oversight in transport. The court basically said, you created a chemical bomb, you failed to label it as a bomb, and you allowed it to be parked next to a residential neighborhood without warning the local fire department.
It was a massive victory for accountability briefly. The government quickly appealed, and the case made its way up to the Supreme Court. In a narrow 4-3 decision, the Supreme Court overturned the lower court's ruling and completely absolved the federal government of liability.
Which is just a gut punch.
Their reasoning hinged on a specific clause within the Federal Tort Claims Act, an exemption for discretionary functions.
So what does this all mean, in practice? Because on the surface, it feels like a massive, cynical loophole. The government dictates the manufacture of a highly reactive chemical, packages it in flammable paper and wax, parks it next to a boomtown, and when it blows up, they claim immunity because their negligence was a discretionary function.
Well, the Supreme Court's majority argued that there is a legal difference between operational negligence, like a government driver hitting a pedestrian in policy-making decisions.
Okay.
They ruled that the cabinet-level decision to export fertilizer to Europe and the broad regulatory plans surrounding that program were high-level policy choices, discretionary functions. Therefore, even if the subsequent execution of those plans resulted in tragedy, the government could not be sued for making the initial policy decision.
Which is exactly why the 3 dissenting justices were furious. They argued that a private corporation would absolutely be held liable for such careless handling of inherently dangerous materials, and the government should be held to the exact same standard.
It's a very valid argument.
But ultimately, the highest court in the land offered no legal remedy for the victims. It required a separate act of Congress in 1955 to finally grant nearly $17 million in compassionate relief to the survivors, completely bypassing the tort system.
Right. And while the legal outcome was bitterly disappointing for the victims, the disaster did force immediate sweeping changes in how hazardous industries actually operate on the ground. You mentioned the hazmat documents from the Fusion Center earlier.
Yeah, the modern protocol.
Following the disaster, refineries in the Gulf area recognized they could never rely on fragmented local responses again. They quickly formed the Industrial Mutual Aid System to ensure pooled resources and coordinated emergency command.
The protocols were entirely rewritten. Today, if you look at the Emergency Response Guidebook, the rules for dealing with ammonium nitrate fires in a transport scenario, like a derailed train or a cargo ship, are absolute.
Crystal clear.
The first rule is do not attempt to fight the fire. You immediately evacuate a half-mile radius in all directions. You isolate the scene and you call for specialized chemical response teams.
Because we learned definitively that throwing a little water on a decomposing oxidizer is a death sentence. The strict regulations we have today regarding chemical storage, distance from residential zoning, and mandatory material safety data sheets are all direct descendants of the failures in Texas City.
You mentioned that 2-ton anchor earlier. It's wild to think these massive pieces of shrapnel are just sitting in local memorial parks today. And that brings us to the theme of scars and memory and how a community lives alongside that history.
It's an important part of the story.
The Texas City Museum actually has an entire exhibit dedicated not just to the 1947 disaster, but to another eerily similar explosion in their history. And by the way, if you're in the area, they have a free admission day coming up on July 30th, 2025.
It's a fascinating historical parallel that the museum highlights. Before the Grandcamp, the area experienced the explosion of the USS Westfield.
Right.
The Westfield was originally a civilian Staten Island ferry boat that the U.S. Navy purchased and retrofitted into an ironclad gunboat during the Civil War.
A ferry boat turned warship.
Indeed. And during the Battle of Galveston in 1863, the Westfield ran heavily aground, To prevent the ship from falling into the hands of approaching Confederate forces, Commander William B. Renshaw ordered the vessel rigged with explosives to scuttle it.
But it didn't go as planned.
No, the charges detonated prematurely, killing Renshaw and several of his crewmen in a massive blast.
So you have two massive maritime explosions separated by 84 years, occurring in practically the exact same waters, and the archaeological records from Texas A&M show how they're preserving this.
Their conservation research laboratory did some incredible work.
Yeah, they took the heavily concreted iron fragments of the Westfield dredged up from the shipping channel and actually reconstructed the ship's boiler. They used the original artifacts attached to a wireframe structure to show exactly what it looked like.
And placing the 1863 Westfield boiler right alongside the artifacts of the 1947 Grandcamp disaster is a profound choice by the Texas City Museum. It serves as a physical timeline of the area's resilience.
It really connects the two events.
It shows a continuous institutional commitment to preserving its collective memory. A community acknowledging the complex, sometimes incredibly violent history of its port, and ensuring those hard-learned lessons remain visible.
It's a heavy history to carry, but a deeply necessary one. So, to wrap up our deep dive today, a booming post-war economy, a society treating industrial risk as the cost of prosperity, and a few tragic miscalculations. A single jug of drinking water, a captain's order to batten the hatches and pump steam, combined with a catastrophic lack of regulatory oversight to wipe out a third of a city and fundamentally rewrite modern emergency response.
And that is the crucial takeaway for you listening to this today. The next time you find yourself frustrated by what seem like tedious, bureaucratic local zoning laws keeping factories away from houses or strict occupational safety regulations,
Or those brightly colored, diamond-shaped hazardous material placards you see plastered on the backs of trucks on the highway.
exactly, remember why they exist. Those rules, those exhaustive safety protocols, were literally written in the ashes of places like Texas City. They exist because we learned the hard way what happens when a society prioritizes speed and profit over safety and preparedness.
It absolutely makes you look at the mundane details of the world a little differently. And I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day. Every single day, thousands of tons of highly reactive, hazardous materials pass quietly through our communities.
Right under our noses.
They move on unmarked freight trains rumbling past our backyards and on tractor trailers sharing our lanes on the interstate. We sleep, we work, and we live our lives right next to these moving, invisible supply lines.
It's a fragile system.
If the complex web of regulations holding that entire system together were relaxed tomorrow to save a little time and money, would the people living a half-mile away even know what they were looking at if the smoke started to rise? Picture that crisp April morning, the simple puff of unusual smoke, and ask yourself, would we recognize the danger before the pressure cooker fails? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.